why would the fans input lead to better financial decisions? Two mix on this. Firstly, it's because we have to understand that investors don't make very good ones because they aren't interested as much in the sport as these fans are. What do investors look like? They typically have large amount of investments in different areas. Maybe it's other sporting teams, maybe it's a sporting team in an oil company, things like this. For them, it is just about the input and output and the money, whereas the fans understand that it's more nuanced than that. These fans are not, the fans are much more dedicated to the sport and to that team than we see these investors are. The fans are also not the entirety of the people watching these games, but they represent the most dedicated people who know what the public want best because they are part of that public. Secondly, why do fans have an incentive to make these good financial decisions? Well, one, it's because the teams that they care about are traditionally like their one team. If you are buying a season ticket, you are buying it for the team that you support the most. These ticket holders often also own merch and things like that for the team. This means that they want to see that team thrive. Then we have to ask ourselves, why are the decisions they're making likely to be informed? Well, one, under our model, we can establish that their decisions won't be any worse than investors because they have the same information. But secondly, they will be better because these fans have likely grown up with the sport and they can sense the long-term trends which will help their team. This looks like not firing a coach who has had a long, successful history just because he's had a bad couple of seasons. This is why we can see that fans will make better financial decisions. The outcomes of this are that teams are generally upping the caliber of sport, which draws more interest. And generally, these matches under our side of the house are more interesting because they have much higher stakes because the fans have made the decisions that led the team there to be there. So they feel to some extent that they are personally responsible for the fails and the successes of those teams. Secondly, there are obviously financial benefits because teams want more money. Teams want more money to go into their teams because fans want more money to go into the teams because it makes things like merch cheaper. They can pay players higher salaries. They can make money go down to their smaller clubs as well. For example, the Chelsea Football Club can support their under-19s because they've got this more money, and that will encourage the younger generation to play. And this is important because it encourages young people who otherwise wouldn't have this opportunity because they come from marginalized communities. A second outcome is that it draws in fans to the sport. Naturally, people are going to purchase season tickets if they feel like they get a bigger stake in the game for doing that, which means that this is an increased number of season ticket holders and more devoted fans. Why is this a good thing? Because it gives them a hobby and creates larger community, which is generally better because it's a sense of belonging for people. It doesn't just draw hardcore fans in, it also draws in casual fans. Because the sport is now seen as an activity influenced by the fans. I'll now take a POI.
Would nostalgia not make the fans irrationally choose to keep a coach that has washed out strategies for the sake of the memories of the old time?
A fan that supports a team, they want to see that team succeed. So if they've seen this coach and they believe he can do better, then they will support him. But if they realize that these devoted fans, especially the season ticket holders, are paying very close attention to that sport, they realize, okay, maybe he is washed out, then they will make that decision to replace him. Whereas an investor might not make that decision because they've had him for ages, they've formed a relationship with him, they trust him, even though it's not beneficial for the team. That is why the investor's decision is always going to be better for that sports team. My second point is how we see more diversity in the sport. Firstly, we need to understand that historically there has not been a huge amount of progress in sport because of investors. We see this as things such as not hiring female coaches because these coaches aren't seen as successful all the time, and the investors are diverted from anything which would decrease profitability. And so they don't want to take risks. We want to see these risks taken because they are what progresses a team in a sport. When fans make the decisions, we get a better range of outcomes for the players. How does this happen? Two reasons. Firstly, fans have a much better incentive to look after the players' well-being because these players are the people that the fans worship and respect. So, for example, if there's a coach which pushes players too far mentally or physically and is letting the team down, then fans are likely to see this and say, no, we don't want this coach anymore because they are harming the people that we love. Secondly, investors typically come from overseas nations where they aren't as invested with the progress of the country, whereas fans come from all backgrounds of sport. Take football in England, for example. It's a unifier in that country, which means that the fans are likely to make decisions that represent progressive values for that country. We also see an outcome here that we make the fan base less hooliganized, for lack of a better word. The fans typically in today's world, typically the fans with the loudest voices are the racist old white dudes, because they get more platform in the media, because our media is a little bit biased and unfair. With our proposed model, every fan gets an equal vote, and this is important because it creates more diversity within the sport and the whole sporting as a whole community.
Cool. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I call on the first negating speaker to begin their team's case.
I'm audible, right? Okay, cool. AF lost today's debate when they hinged their model on democracy. What they actually perpetuate is financial instability, because people are going to be wanting these tickets to be able to have this influence. Or secondly, they're just giving all of the power to the rich people who can afford it, meaning it's not even a fair democracy in their world anyway. What is our path to victory in today's debate? We need to prove that we get better outcomes for the team, or that we get better outcomes for the fan bases. How are we going to do this? Firstly, through proving why season ticket holders do not have the best interest of the team. Secondly, why status quo decision makers, for example, team owners and managers, make comparatively better decisions. Now moving on to the characterization of what season ticket holders looks like. It looks like a fan of a sports team, right? They're emotionally and identical, and like with their identity are linked. They've grown around the community and family, all supporting their local team. They've gone to the pub, de-stressing after a long day at work, to go and watch a football game. They're using it as an excuse later in life to catch up and reconnect. They're very intertwined with their sport. Or even if they're not like that emotionally connected, they're just extremely invested because of the love of the sport itself, not necessarily the connections that come with it. But the other characterization we tell you is that the people who are rich and get season tickets for status will be able to flex the fact that they are rich and they can afford this, so why not? Both teams and managers have the same incentive as ticket holders, which means that all of the content they brought you about investors and overseas nations won't be as invested. It's simply not true, because they want the team to succeed, because that is how they get a profit on their investment, right? So while their reasoning may be different, for example, like promotions and pay rises for managers, or extremely emotionally interested invested fans in the team's success, like the outcome is still the same. They want the same thing. This looks like when India lost the Cricket World Cup and lots of investor fans committed suicide. That just proves how committed they are to that team. But lastly, the incentives align enough that it becomes a question of solely capacity to make rational decisions, which we will prove to you that only corporations can make. Now for some rebuttal. Firstly, they try to tell us in their model that they're going to give a review, but there was no reasoning as to why people are going to read that review. It was just asserted that it will happen. This is not true for a couple of reasons. People are busy. They don't have the time, but more importantly, a lot of them have a belief that they know everything that is in the sport, because that dedicated knowledge will come in a sub, but just thought it was important to note. Secondly, they said that investors looking for money are not as dedicated as fans, but if fans are dedicated to success, it means that the players could continue to be like emotionally abused by a coach because that coach is successful for the team. There's no mechanisms as to protection there. But lastly, they tell you they're going to get a bigger fan base, but like casual fans, which they thought they could bring in through these season tickets, are unlikely to do it if they're not that invested, because it's going to be expensive. But moreover, they're less educated and invested in the sport, so probably can make less like good decisions for that team, especially if they're not reading the manual or whatever they said they were going to be. Moving on to our first point, which is why season ticket holders do not have the best interest of the team. We need to prove that while fans believe they know best, this is unfortunately unlikely, if not impossible, due to their irrationality. Why is this? Firstly, they don't know what takes place in the locker rooms. Part A of this is that sport fans and season ticket holders watch the games. They're not investing themselves inside the locker rooms for the majority of the team talks. But even if this isn't true, there's two reasons why they still don't know what's happening inside the locker room. Firstly, the sports teams don't want the public to see any instability within the team, arguments that may happen before, because it's a very high pressure situation. Or secondly, they don't want to make their strategies public and enlighten the other teams to how like their team functions, because that's essentially going to end up in them losing. But secondly, because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, season ticket holders believe that they know what's best, not the corporations who make the decision in the status quo. The Dunning-Kruger effect discusses the bias that people think they have superior knowledge. For example, people who go, oh my gosh, the ref is so wrong, despite the ref having read the manual and you not having read that manual. This is why the review won't be read. People believe they have the knowledge. Part B of this is people just are like egotistical, right? You've got a certain egotism that comes with the status of being a season ticket holder. You go, I go to all of these things, I'm so good, but you're actually not. But secondly, if you're a dedicated fan, you're dedicated to the sport, you're dedicated to the team, you're dedicated to their success, which means that in your mind, if you're that dedicated, you know what is best for the team. But thirdly and importantly, this policy that AF is trying to propose is exacerbating their ego, because now they've got that power and they think that the corporations trust their knowledge of the season ticket holders. Their like whole egoism is now validated by being involved in the critical decision-making process. And so egos also mean more bureaucracy, where ticket holders argue with each other, especially because they're so fanatic and staunch in their own ideas. But thirdly, you're driven by nostalgia, and nostalgia means people watch, like nostalgia is why people watch sports and support certain teams, right? It's what we heard from AF as well. But when you've got the most fanatic people and people who have grown up around the game, it looks like 5 years ago, a team won and did well in a tournament with a certain manager and player, but now that coach is outdated. The players are falling to pieces because they've been brutally, tackled over and over again in rugby, and their limbs are falling apart. But because the ticket holders thrive on success, it means that veto, it means they would not veto dropping, it would veto dropping, not dropping these certain coaches and players, despite the team not being successful, because they've got the status quo bias. They believe what happened 5 years ago is going to happen today, which is furthered by the optimism bias, which is why AF said that when AF said not firing the coach because they're successful in the past is actually a really bad claim. But the second part of this is we're telling you that you're not allowing the team to grow because of the reasons we gave. You've got less changeover in players and coaches. It means you don't have fresh players and coaches and new tactics who are necessary for success to occur. But fourthly, we tell you that wealthy corporations can buy the majority of the season tickets because of cronyism. They can give it to their friends. They then essentially can exploit this majority because they can create a voting block. It means that it's like the softer hard takeover of a team by vetoing new players and coaches. So their whole principal point on democracy means that this isn't a majority vote because of the mechanisms we've just provided. So note that the power AF gets for these holders is a stop change. So it's going to stop the team from changing in situations that are necessary, because the team wants to carry out these major transactions because they know it's going to let them succeed. What is the impact and what does this mean? It stops the team from improving due to situations and situations for central change. It puts pressure on the team due to unnecessary losses. It looks like a washed out coach refusing to try a new strategy because they know they can be kept in power by selling nostalgia. Secondly, it creates losses when you're not able to change and adapt due to the vetoes. It probably means that you lose more games. But this more importantly means that players feel disassociated from the sport because they're continually losing through no fault of their own. But secondly, they feel disassociated from the fans because the fans are the one keeping them in this vicious cycle. It means that the emotional harm of losses due to investment, these fans are heartbroken. It means it means that people are committing suicide. A Liverpool fan killed himself because the game was 4-0 against his team when they lost. So what this means at the end of the point is that we have proven to you why these season ticket holders are irrational. Moving on to our second sub, which is why the status quo decision makers are comparatively better. We need to prove that managers have the better capacity to influence decisions when it comes to the team. Why is this? How does the team profit? Teams profit when they're winning, when they're garnering a fan base and they're maintaining a loyal fan base. This is because they're buying tickets. It means that sponsors are sponsoring them because it's winning. This is the reason why changing and like these policies need to occur. So when it comes to like selling the team, the manager does this because they've got capital coming in, which is overall good for the team because they can afford better players to buy and trade. Secondly, they had access to better managers and coaches because a larger entity coming in to buy a team puts money in to make a return. It means that they're used to investing in these players. They've got access to connections. But thirdly, with infrastructure, they are able to buy the necessary infrastructure to facilitate better trains. It looks like having better stadiums. But comparatively, you've got a bunch of fearful, irrational fans freaking out because you had Saudis wanting to invest in the team, like they spoke about overseas investment. But actually, this investment is unlikely to change the team's identity because the team's identity is built into their fan base. It is what it means for the team. Who owns it does not matter. But secondly, money is good for the progress of the team. And the decision makers have an interest to protect fans, with especially the season ticket holders, because they are giving the money to those corporations to continue succeeding. This is why I'm extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I call on the second affirming speaker to continue their team's case.
Kia ora, guys. Am I audible? Sweet as. I am going to accept POIs in the chat, but I will just actually let you know when I want the POI. So you don't need to worry about that too much. Look, if Sam O'Grady got a vote on the future of Liverpool, perhaps they would have won this morning, right? Isabella told you that there are two ways we have of winning this debate. Either we get better outcomes for fans or we get better outcomes for the players and staff, right? Not only are both of those worse off under the status quo, where they are like at an all-time low, but actually we're able to create better outcomes for both of them on our side of the house. Okay, what do we have today in today's debate? Firstly, just a little bit of context about like characterization, who like actually is able to benefit from this model, and just like rebutting some of the like obvious things that come up in the case. But then secondly, on the two kind of key points of clash that we get today, which are around like the economic benefit to teams and like the changing culture of these teams, right? Okay, firstly then on like a little bit of characterization on how this model actually works, right? And what we've just heard from their first speaker is that like there's some sort of out mechanism where like wealthy corporations can just like buy up all of the tickets and thus manipulate the vote. Obviously, we think this is a little bit ridiculous, right? There are going to be mechanisms in place if you ensure a democratic system, that there will be democratic protection mechanisms in some kind. This could look like something like ensuring that people who vote have to go to like a certain amount of games, like actually use their season tickets or something like that. Or it can just be as simple as like, hey, we got a bulk order from Disney. They probably actually aren't doing this in the best interests of democracy. We're able to cancel that because the board still has like some sort of executive control over this democratic system. Okay, let's have a look at the characterization. Then they tell us about who these tickets go to. And they tell us that like season tickets are exclusively going to go to the rich, and that kind of undercuts a lot of our mechanisms on their side of the house. Right. We see that like tickets are generally like season tickets are like the more affordable option than buying a ticket to each and every game or like choosing when you want to go to see a game. This means that the people who are buying these season tickets are likely to be the people who have to save it and want to go see every game, but can't actually like afford. Like, right, if we're talking about like rich, like ultra wealthy families, they can just afford to like pay for each match and go and see it individually, and they can also go and see other teams' games when they feel like it. They're likely to be less invested, and they're likely to not want to save up and spend as much money on a season ticket. All right. We've kind of covered that there, and it kind of shows that their characterization is mostly wrong on their side of the house. So let's move on to the kind of economic points and see what we get here. Okay, first of all, they tell us that like most of our model falls through because our fans just don't have the business experience, right? First of all, we tell you that like, firstly, sport just functions differently as a business, right? Investors typically don't have the sporting knowledge, etc., to like understand why a sporting company would be successful, right? Good example of this is like the Saudi investment funds, which own like sports teams in the UK, because they actually like don't, then they're invested in like a numerous amount of other things, and like their key knowledge isn't on sporting. They haven't been raised with football, and so there's a different thing. So we actually see that like actually good sporting decisions do lead to good business decisions. But even if we don't get like the best business knowledge from the fans, we get a combination of their sporting knowledge and the investors' business knowledge, because we are not striking out investors' input in our side of the house. And that's something that's incredibly important to know, right? On our side of the house, we get both the input from investors and the input from fans, right? We get a combination of those types of knowledge, and neither can progress without the other. And we think that it's an incredibly important partnership to have when you're developing that type of system. Why can't NEG actually provide this? They can't provide this because there's no mechanism on their side of the house where fans can have a reasonable input, which means that this decision is entirely monopolized by shareholders. That's incredibly harmful, and it's something that we're proud to have as a benefit on our side of the house. Then, how do we actually benefit investors? How do we actually get a word for investors, a better word for investors, right? On their side of the house, like investors are actually just stabbing in the dark, right? They don't really have an idea what fans are going to want from decisions, and so they don't really have an idea on how they're going to ensure better ticket sales. On our side of the house, they have an audience to bounce that back against. They have an audience which will understand like what fans want and what fans like are likely to pay for, and so like they can actually take it to their group of season ticket holders and understand that. Because the season ticket holders have such an active role in governance, this is an exclusive benefit on our side of the house. We also get more investors on our side of the house because fans who become involved in the season ticket holder scheme get a taste for governance and are more likely to invest heavily in the business. This is especially true for like richer fans, right? But like thirdly, like NEG might tell you that there's like an inherent tension between like investors and fans. We say that there's actually like very heavy incentives on our side of the house for them to cooperate, right? Like for example, right, because of the kind of voting block that we have in place, right? Neither of them can make a decision without cooperating with the other, which means that we have to get some sort of cooperation, some sort of mutual agreement between fans and investors, which is something that they can't get on their side of the house. They tell us that people won't read the reviews. We think this is pretty ridiculous. Like obviously people want their team to win. They're going to like do as much research as they can to try and get these best decisions, especially when these reviews are only coming out like when a major decision is being made, like once a year. That's another thing, right? They tell us that fans aren't rational actors because they just don't understand what's happening in the locker room. First of all, like we tell you that most of this debate doesn't take place in the locker room, right? It's not about micro level decisions between like individual sporting players, right? It's kind of about the bigger things like how the brand markets itself, how they're able to sell tickets, things like that. And investors don't actually see that side of things either. So it's irrelevant totally in this debate. But secondly, like fans get the analysis from media, they get the analysis from like social media, they get all sorts of different analyses that they can put together. And as a collective, the fans have a much bigger range of perspectives than the investors, right? So that means that like we actually get less of a homogenous viewpoint because the fans are able to like cancel out because they see the games from different perspectives. That's super important on our side of the house. So we think that we actually get better economic benefits from for the teams on our side of the house because fans have a better combination of business and sporting knowledge. I'll take a POI really quickly now.
Why would investors have an incentive to manage the team rather than leaving it to managers and team leaders who actually know what they're doing?
Look, as we told you, like this is a debate that's about the important big decisions, right? Which investors do get to make. So like naturally they're going to like choose like a new manager, or they're going to like choose whether to sell the team or not. That's what's defined in the mood. And we think that like actually saying that investors are making these micro level decisions is not something that we've ever stood for on our side of the house. And it's not something that fans will do on our side of the house at all. Right, on cultural point, right? They tell us that like fans are just largely likely to be conservative and not make the most like forward-leaning decisions. Sure, in today's world, the voices that get heard the loudest on it in the like sporting community are like the old white dudes, the hooligans, right? On their side of the house, investors are only going to listen to the voices that are featured in the media. These are the loudest voices, and these are like the old conservative white people, right? On our side, one vote for one person, right? This is like this gives a more diverse range of voices, and investors actually have to listen to the collective of fans, which we know in sporting environments is a more diverse environment. This is better for players who are mostly like people of color and minorities and require support for fans who actually seem like them, but it's better for minority fans too because it creates a safer environment where they feel more respected. There's a little point on nostalgia there. We think like obviously like fans want to see their team succeed, so they're not going to be blinded by nostalgia to a huge extent. But even in the case that they are choosing a washed out coach, they're making a decision that's based on like what is popular among the fans. So even in the case that this maybe loses them a couple of games, it's still going to bring in more money for the team, which is an overall long-term benefit, right? Okay, so on culture, what do we see, right? We actually see that like we get a safer and like more diverse culture within these sports, which is like hugely important. Okay, at the end of like the speech, right, what do we see? We tell you that, like, even in Neg's best case scenario, where Isabella's point about fans like having the best knowledge is completely struck out of the water, we tell you that, like, the sporting knowledge that these fans have, or the knowledge of what fans actually want, is still completely undeniable. And this serves as an important complement to the business knowledge of investors who can't make a decision without fans on our side of the house. We win this debate at the point where we're able to bring players higher salaries, fund community ventures, things like that. But we also believe that we're able to win this debate where we get increased participation from the type of fans who are typically cut from the conversation. We are the only side of this debate that is able to stand for progress and protection. Stand for a better sporting community, stand with side affirming.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now invite the second negating speaker to continue their team's case.
So guys, how would you like to take POI, as we're just a little confused?
We'll say in the chat, yeah. So I'm guessing I'm audible. All right, cheers. I want to make one thing abundantly clear. Investors in sports teams don't blindly rush in to trying to manage the entire team by themselves. If they have limited knowledge, their decision is going to be to hire those advisors, those consultants, those statisticians, people who have been successful football managers to help them do that job. It's much easier to act in a rational way when you have that profit incentive that you want to make a return on investment. When your investment in a team is monetary and tangible, you are much more likely to be rational than when that investment is emotional and intangible. That is why we win today's debate, because side affirming cannot come up here and assert to us that these investors are blind idiots and that these fans who've watched people kick a ball around a field suddenly know exactly why players are picked. Three things I'll be doing in my speech then. Firstly, on outcomes for fans and teams. Secondly, on outcomes for players. And thirdly, on why we benefit the wider fan base for these teams. Firstly, then, on outcomes for fans and teams. Jess already gave you many reasons why fans are likely to act in an irrational way. And these were quite well mechanized, quite frankly. Things like nostalgia, things like egotism, like yelling at the TV when someone gets subbed off and you disagree, things like the hooliganism that side affirming actually talks about, and things like the lack of knowledge when you don't see those locker room conversations. Investors do have sporting knowledge because they want to make a return on investment when they go in this field. And even if they don't, that's why they ask for advice from those statisticians, because they want that return on investment. That is enough reasoning to defeat this point. What we instead hear as affirming's key push is that these people give a more varied perspective and that democracy is good. Look, this is the same logic as saying we should put a monkey in parliament, because it doesn't matter if you get a more varied voice if that voice is fundamentally useless, blinding, and irrational. And it's not very varied anyway, as we've already given you from the start. One, this is going to be those dedicated fanatics who who are probably quite conservative, who've been around the sport for a long time, and those democratic mechanisms of having been to a few games you try to model in at second only serve to worsen this harm. And secondly, if you don't have those mechanisms, then what you get is this flooding of people trying to use this as a way to buy into a team, because supposedly if investors are these big bad people who are just messing around with sports teams, then they're going to be doing those types of harms if we accept your characterization. We also say that it's just an assertion that democracy is good anyway, because having a bunch of statisticians and a bunch of technocrats is significantly better than having a bunch of people who watch people kick balls on the field and yell at the television about random senile things, okay? If Sam O'Grady got a vote on the Liverpool game, and let's say he is the exception for understanding why Liverpool lost, that doesn't matter if you get people flooding in to buy tickets, if you get this suddenly wider community, as First Affirming tells us about, because that floods out that rational voice if it is the exception. And also, if a manager, the reason locker room conversations and that type of information matters, that none of these fans have access to, is actually very, very fundamentally important, all right? Because if teammates, say, aren't compatible with each other, if they're having these arguments and it's leading to losing games, firstly, a team is not going to publicize that information because it looks bad on them. Secondly, they're not going to publicize strategic talks because that's how they lose to other teams. And thirdly, like, even if there is a review system, why is someone who's solely invested in watching the football going to either read that or actually understand what any of it means, okay? That's not actually going to lead to better outcomes. That is why you lose this point. Lastly, then, on remodeling democratic fail-safe mechanisms under this point of democracy, look, that just leads to things like ignoring the racism amongst those older conservative fans who've been around this for a long time, and actually worsens hooliganism. And those new people you suddenly want to flood in don't actually have that specialist knowledge anyway, and that was actually one of the key benefits that you first gave us, so your case is already quite inconsistent. Look, what we say is investors do care because they want a team to win, because their dedication to a sport doesn't make you capable of making good team decisions. Years of watching people kick a ball about and yelling at the TV doesn't amount to understanding the complex tactical statistical reasons for why a player might be picked. It just simply refer to the classic film of Moneyball, where players are perhaps undervalued because the audience thinks they throw a ball funny, when in reality, they're actually very high quality and able to score good amounts of points for that team. What we also say is that they don't have access to that same information for the reason I've already given. That's already undermining them. And what we instead care from AF is that this is good because you create this voting block that is not going to fire a historically successful coach. Look, that's a bad thing, because 5 years ago was not now, because the senility, the outdated strategy that comes with these players that comes with these coaches does not matter, because ultimately that is what is leading to them losing games. Because how you succeeded 5 years ago in a fans' mind might be so important that does not matter as far as winning games, which in reality is what their goal is, even if they don't know how to achieve it. What we also hear from a key push is that this draws people to the sport and grows the community. Look, if that even is the case, then you undermine all of your benefits about fans being these experienced, educated, and dedicated fans, because you're getting new people flooding in. But also we say that this people flood in to watch a game because they bandwagon on them winning, not because you suddenly give them some power in something they don't actually care about, that they have to pay for. And that's not even a reason to get this. You don't get this benefit anyway. What we lastly hear about is the idea that, like, the fan base becomes less hooliganized. Look, what you're already conceding is that this is a problem in the first place. We don't see how this changes, because the fans who are going to be buying these tickets are going to be those more dedicated, more hooligan fans. You don't solve the problem of racism. You actually make it much worse when you give these people a voice and legitimate power in this view. We also say that the media doesn't give those old racist white dudes a platform, because we as a society have moved past that. The media is generally much more liberal, so that's not actually the status quo anyway. You're actually worsening this. Secondly, then, on helping the players. Look, you actually harm new young players just as a baseline, because you now have a voting block of people not wanting to remove old players, okay? David Beckham was probably good like 5-6 years ago. If David Beckham just keeps getting paid because a team can't sack him, then where are you getting those new players coming in who suddenly on your side of the house want to care about the sport? We also hear is that as the push is that sport is undemocratic and not about well-being. Look, we question why fans are likely to care any more about well-being, especially when there is that issue of racism, especially when, say, a bunch of black players lose a penalty kick out and then suddenly get thrown in water by football fans, that's evidence that these people probably shouldn't have a say about player well-being in the first place, okay? And lastly, how do you get more money in players participating? The thought of this sounds nice, but we really need to think about things like the main benefit of sponsorship here. Investors are going to sponsor a winning team. They're going to sponsor a team that has a more stable structure of leadership, not anonymous people buying tickets. That's probably not something that you would trustworthy put much trust in, nor that you're going to invest in. And if your goal is to get more sponsors, that actually greatly undermines the benefit of foreign investors not caring about local sporting issues, because like you're actually still getting foreign investors on your side of the house. Lastly, then, to split on how we empower the wider fan base. Look, I've already told you throughout this debate, like the ingrained proof of this. Firstly is on like representation, because these aren't actually the wider fan base buying it. It's a select group of fanatics, a select group of wealthy people. Secondly, you're actually barring out those external entities that might want to override the team irresponsibly or without proper checks and balances, when you actually, prevent them from just buying up tickets and getting this type of say. We also just say, lastly, that when the team wins more, as we said, is the main incentive for these people at the start that they are trying to achieve on either side, that is better for the wider fan base, that is better for the new players, the old play, the new fans, the old fans, so proud to oppose.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now call on the third affirming speaker.
All right, guys, can everyone hear me? Cool, I'm just gonna need a few seconds to set up all my bits of paper and then I'll be right with you. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. So what have we seen in this debate so far, right? We've seen a huge mischaracterization of the types of people that are these ticket holders, the season ticket holders. We've seen a mischaracterization of where people get their information and how they will act, right? The main thing that has been a huge point of clash that has a few subheadings here, right, is that ticket holders won't make good decisions, right? They've told us about the democracy and about the way that they make them and their motives, okay? So first I'm gonna focus on democracy. They've tried to tell us that it wouldn't be fair. These people are rich. They have the same motives as investors. Actually, the first thing we tell you, okay, first, they actually don't have the same motives. They want the same outcomes, but their motives are very different. And that is because they have a knowledge of the sport that investors don't have. Often these people have grown up in families where sport is huge. They are often used to play at a young age. Possibly they didn't go professional, but they know about the sport they used to play. They're actually super involved with it. Second thing, this means that they have the long term in mind. They know about their history. They have the long term of this team that they really support in mind, because it is a family thing. It is a part of their lifestyle. And they want that long term benefit that investors don't want, because all investors want is to make a profit, right? They want a quick scheme to make money, possibly in the long term as well, but all they really want is to make this money and then sell the team off. The third thing we tell you is that they're the average fan, right? That watches a few games and then moves on, right? They're people that are really, really interested in the sport. They're invested in the team. They know about the team's history. They know about the sports history. They know the sort of things that go on. They won't make dumb decisions just because of nostalgia, because they actually know that times move on and sometimes you do need a new coach, okay? The fourth thing we see is that actually just sport functions very differently as a business, right? These people don't need financial knowledge. What they need is a knowledge of the sport that investors and stats cannot give you, okay? Fifthly, we tell you that even if they manage to prove this is true, okay, we tell you that on our side, fans will feel responsibility for the team, and this actually encourages them to go and research, to become financially literate, and it encourages a better community of more informed people, okay? And in the very last thing, even if they somehow manage to prove all of this wrong, investors still actually have an input. They get to put forward the people that they want, but they just have someone to bounce it off of, okay? And I'm going to talk about that later, about why it's good for investors. Moving into the next thing about the diversity, okay? What they've tried to tell us here is that they don't know what happens in the locker rooms. And then they tell you that fans have big egos, and this leads to them being driven by nostalgia, okay? First of all, just a bit of direct rebuttal to their first bit about they don't know what goes on in the locker room and this is going to result in really bad outcomes. Will's already touched on this, so just a little bit of recap, right? It's not about the small acts, it's about the larger scale stuff, which really isn't impacted that heavily by what goes on in the locker room, right? We see that even if it is, players can give interviews, they can actually, show what happens in the locker room, and people will have an incentive to dig deeper and find this out. At our worst, right, this is symmetrical because investors don't find that out as well, because managers don't want to show investors the really dirty, nasty side. So we can't see that on their side of the house, even if they prove all this wrong, that their side is actually different, okay? So then the next thing I'd just like to note before I go into this is that in their best case, right, if they somehow manage to prove all of what I said wrong, this actually really can't stand in the first place. And that's what I'm about to go and say, right? So the first thing is that they're driven by nostalgia. They tell us that there will be a less of a change, right? That people won't get rid of washed out players and coaches because the fans become attached to them. In our very first speech, we provided you with several mechanisms about why fans care about teams, why they want to see them succeed, and why this actually won't happen, why they care about the long-term effects, and they won't just rely on nostalgia. All right, we've proved that fans keep the best interests of the teams at heart. They won't keep washed out players. They won't keep managers that are really terrible to the players because they idolize these players. The majority of fans idolize the players, not the managers. All right. Moving on from that, the next thing we see is that they tell us about how there's going to be less diversity. Okay, and I have a few responses to this. So first of all, the thing is that they have a background that they can go on, right? Because the managers are going to publish this report, which they will read, which I'm going to go into soon, about the proposed people. They'll have the backgrounds of these people, the backgrounds of their staff. They will actually have the same information as these investors. And fans will be able to make informed decisions, right? This means that on their side of the house, investors really don't have that much of an edge because the fans will be informed. The second thing we tell you is the typical types of investors, okay? We see high income class people. We see conservative people with conservative countries from conservative backgrounds. We see mostly males and not many people of color. What we see is the typical fans, okay? This is where they mischaracterize it. We see families who maybe are super invested in sport, right? It's a huge family thing, and they don't want to pay for their children for every single game, so they buy a season pass. We see young sports players who are super invested in sport, who want to be close to the players. We see this as actually quite a huge portion that they really just marginalized and not touched on this debate. And then we tell you that even if in some cases, right, the investors and the ticket holders are quite similar, right? The culture is actually dying off here. We see this hugely when we look at sport in the 80s, right? The kind of culture and the kind of actions that went on then compared to now. Right now, we see much more people of color actually in the sport. We see younger people invested in sports, and we see it as much more of a community than it was back then. All right, and so this means that there is actually more diversity within the ticket holders, right? We see larger groups of people from different backgrounds. This is so much better than investors. And it means that even if the majority gets a vote, even in our worst case where the majority takes it, the minority still has a say. They're actually being projected by the media, then their voices are still getting out there. And this will eventually result in much more change, okay? And I think that pretty much covers most of the diversity in sport thing, right? Because anything they say can just be disproved by this, right? The fans are still somewhat conservative, but nowhere near as much as investors, right? This is our worst case, and that is why we win, because even in our worst case, we create more diversity, more discussions, and better outcomes for the players, the managers, the investors, and the fans, right? We create outcomes for all stakeholders that investors simply cannot create because they do not get these sort of inputs in. All right, I'll take a POI now if you guys have one.
If the investors are as money hungry as you assume, why are they not as incentivized as fans to feel responsible for the team, considering they are incentivized to make a profit?
They will feel incentivized to make a profit from the team, right? But we can assume that most investors actually have other revenue sources as well, because we see people who have huge amounts of money, they won't just be invested in the sport. They might have shares in oil companies. They like to diversify this, right? This is what investors like to do. And that is why we see that fans are a better input, because even if in our worst case, they are still somewhat conservative, they are more invested in the sport, and it will create a better community for everyone. All right. So now I'm just going to move into actually the benefits for investors. It's really, really good that you brought that up here, right? So the benefits for investors, because this is something that we haven't seen a lot of, okay? We see that what they want is they want more money, they want profit, and they actually want good decisions for their teams because they're looking for this long-term consistent revenue, okay? We see that on our side, we bring in more fans. They haven't touched on this enough. They really need to bring this up on third. Isabella's told you this from the very beginning. We see that more fans means more tickets, more people buying season tickets, more merch, more media attention on it. And this is just great for everyone involved. The second thing we tell you here is about the decisions. We see that they have a larger group to bounce decisions off and against. We see Will has told you this. They did not respond enough to this. They have a larger group to get this feedback from. And even if investors get less power over their decisions, they won't leave because they are still making a passive profit and the community is being benefited, and therefore they will be making more profit. And that is why we will win this debate today. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I call on the third negating speaker to wrap up the substantive portion of this morning's debate.
Am I audible? Cool. PLIs, I'll take them in chat. And then starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If sport was a democracy, I'm sure that Liverpool would have won instead on this morning, but I'm afraid that is not the case in sport, because sport is about winning. Fundamentally, it is a meritocracy because the ultimate incentive is to win. AF's hinging the entire case on democracy and fair without actually mechanizing how they actually protect fans when they provide this threshold of money to actually give fans a choice in their teams, loses them the debate today. For them to win, they had to prove that fans were not going to be irrational, and secondly, they had to prove that the ticket holders are actually going to benefit the entirety of the fans. When they fail to do that, they lose the debate today. 2 questions I'm going to ask. Firstly, does it protect fans in this weird material on democracy? Secondly, what side makes better decisions, which is more important? But let's just knock the first point out of the debate. Firstly, they claim that there are going to be checks and balances of having ticket holders and not having corporations swamping, right? Actually, the claim before that was they're somehow going to benefit teams by having people buying more tickets, right? We told you that corporations are likely going to swamp. Alternative teams are likely to come and swamp them by buying tickets and then sort of buying the team at a cheaper price by taking part in these decisions, right? Second, gave you a weird model on how they're going to have tickets are going to be somehow used in terms of you have to show up to the tickets, and secondly, you can also detect bulk orders. 2 responses. A, people can get around it pretty easily. If corporations really wanted to, they can probably make individual people and just pay them to do that out of a business. And secondly, this mitigates their monetary benefits if they're putting so many checks and balances to make sure that people aren't going to there aren't random people going to buy their excess money, right? This contention largely means that they're actually not going to they either don't get much money or they lose autonomy and can have malicious ways where other teams come and attack them in terms of buying out their decisions and knocking them down, right? Secondly, then they claim that there are more fans, right? There's somehow going to be more fans and it's going to be better because you lower the threshold of people entering. 2 things. Firstly, they assert that people will have a lower threshold, right? They never explain how you're going to just have one vote per person. We don't see how, does that mean that a layman on the street is going to be able to join and be oh, yes, this is a democracy. I get to do it as well. What is the threshold of democracy, right? Secondly, they don't have this. We're going to flip this by telling you that they raise the threshold of people entering these decisions. What that means is that season tickets are probably extremely expensive.
What's the timer, please? Harper, we can't hear. Aisha, Harper, we can't hear.
Oh, Aisha, Harper, we cannot hear your speaker. She's gone.
She cut out roughly 30 seconds ago.
We're just going to swap with the coach's laptop if that's all good, because the kid's laptop is, I don't know what happened.
It's disconnected.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry. Okay.
Could one of the judges just let us know
When
where?
it stopped.
At 3 minutes.
Could you let me know the last thing I said?
It was the stuff about raising the threshold of people people entering and making decisions.
Okay, cool.
Wait, sorry. Is it okay if I just swap my laptop onto my hotspot, because apparently multiple Auckland teams have dropped out? So
Yeah, that's all good.
I'll just quickly, sorry, that would take me like 2 seconds. All right, there we go. I think we should hopefully be okay.
Cool. So just confirming that the last thing I got up to was that the threshold of people entering is raised.
Yeah.
Okay. Starting my.
What time is that? 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Start a timer for 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll start a timer for 5 minutes. Sorry. Because mine is on 3:30, so I'll wait. Starting my speech again in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so next on like the fact that they claim that threshold is not going to be raised, right? Firstly, we can test their mechanization, because it doesn't make sense in terms of why more fans will be coming, like why more fans will be coming, because what does it mean? Like, does it mean that a layman on the street can come in because they are entitled to a decision because of democracy? It's unclear how they mechanize it. Secondly, we flip this by telling you that threshold of people entering will be raised on their side of the house. Why is this? Because it is so expensive. Because season passes, what they claim was that poor people buy season passes because it's somehow not expensive, because it's somehow less expensive than just buying tickets to every game. Note that this is probably extremely irrational. It's a bundled job. So then that means that any rational person, no matter how rich you are, is probably going to want to save some money. B, the alternative to buying season passes for poor people is to not go to these games at all. When you go to a game, you need time, you need money. Just very clearly characterize to you why it's limited to the rich people who have rich, privileged people who have money and time to be able to go, right? So what does that mean at the end of this? This means that for the decision makers, for the season ticket holders, you raise the threshold so no democracy exists, because this is suddenly a situation where wealth and power matters. True democracy in the context of sports is more like when you have all the fans on an equal level, right? Because under their side, AFA's making a two-tier system where the poor fans do not have any say in what the teams actually do, while the rich fans can manipulate, figure out exposure, can figure out ways to control the team, right? So their side is the side that ruins democracy. Second part of the diversity and minority has a say somehow. Firstly, note that nothing changes in terms of media exposure if this is just decision making. And secondly, minorities probably have less of a say because of the structural problems where minorities are often less advantaged in terms of their financial status because of colonialism, etc. We tell you that they're the side that harms diversity. capacity, right? Finally, in terms of their claim of like more fans, I'm just going to tell you that like more fans probably means more bureaucratic problems, which I'll get into in my second point of clash. What side makes better decisions? Firstly, the key claim here is that they tried to win by making a straw man where like investors directly are making the decisions versus ticket holders making a direct decision. Firstly, claim on knowledge. They claim that you can just read reviews and somehow be informed, right? They firstly note that there was no mechanization in terms of how the fans will be so much more informed with reading reviews. But let's just characterize what the reviews look like. Two alternatives. Firstly, it's simplified which is much more likely because firstly, it's unlikely to provide too much information to so many people because like you could have spies from the other teams as ticket holders. There's nothing that's stopping that, right? So it's unlikely to contain that much information. This is extremely bad because major decisions actually need micro decisions for nuance, for a detailed report, for a well-rounded decision. Having a simplified review then means that you don't have a well-rounded decisions and you're far less likely to make educated decisions. Secondly, then, what if it's complex? Firstly, it's unlikely to read because not everyone has the time, right, to to go through and read like a 2,000-page report on every little detail of like, oh, this dude kicked the ball at like 20 seconds through this match, right? Unlikely because it's so much time. Secondly, even if they are, like, it's symmetrical on both sides of the house because we have people with jobs and we actually are probably better because we have statisticians and people who it literally is their job to like read. So they have much better information and much better supply. Their next claim was that somehow you can integrate business, like fans can integrate business with their common knowledge. Firstly, note that it's replaceable by like the examples we gave in terms of statisticians and people who are actually qualified. Secondly, the content we told you that people are bandwagoning will mean that probably when more people join, then that probably means that like there are a lot of random voices, which will dilute the possibility. So what did we give you on knowledge? Dunning-Kruger, they were not responded to this. They just claimed that there was more experience. Note that although the mechanism still exists in terms of the knowledge, like the faint knowledge where they aren't actually qualified. Secondly, on ego, again, they didn't respond to this. Ego still means that they are going to fight, they're going to argue, they're going to waste time for the teams. Thirdly, on nostalgia, their response was that, note that we asked the POI at first in terms of what happens to nostalgia. They just tried to claim that emotional connections of investors was going to be deep. Note that this is actually like an attempt at straw manning because they're actually the side who actually has the stuff. So at the end of this, like, they know the history when you actually only have a chance to veto, what that means is that you're just going to stop the teams. At the end of this point, investors have much more incentive, as Levi told you, to have the knowledge, to have the information, to actually be connected and want profit and want support to win. So at the end of this point, we're the side that actually provides growth for the teams. We're the side that actually protects democracy and like the state of like the Liverpool future.
Cool, I thank the speaker for that speech and for working through those technical issues. We'll now move into the reply portion of the debate, and as is customary, we reverse the speaking order, so I call on the leader of the negating team to wrap up their team's case.
Never mind. Okay, cool. So unmuted now, so I'm guessing I can be heard. All right, cheers. Get that camera up, see my pretty face. Where are we going with this? Okay.
Frankly, I don't really care if you are a long-term fan of football. Maybe played a bit in year 3 and want to see your team win. because you don't know how to do this more than a highly successful statistician hired by a highly successful investor with money to lose, who wants that team to succeed, needs that team to succeed because they need that return on investment. In fact, if they have multiple streams of income, they probably want people to manage it for them. That's why they're going to hire the best people. That's something we make quite clear on our case. What side affirming instead chooses to engage with is the idea that a bunch of inept investors who don't understand the sport they are investing in are suddenly going to be much, much worse off because they don't have that extensive knowledge of the football fan who yells at his TV and disagrees with every referee's decision. Okay, 2 points of clash in today's today. Firstly, on outcomes for fans and teams. Secondly, for outcomes of players, okay? On the idea of fans and teams, F's entire case wants a democracy that relies on the idea that those characterizations I already gave you of the football fans that they supposedly want to endorse amount to them having this expert knowledge to make a team succeed. We've already given you reasons for why there's a massive distinction between kicking around a ball in year 3, watching sport on the weekends with your mates at the pub, and ultimately just engaging with the sport at this casual, superficial level is much, much more different than making these management decisions, such as due to those locker room discussions that we've brought up, such as those things behind the scenes that lead to those disputes that make a team incompatible. That is something that they don't see, that is something they cannot act on their side. For this democracy to work as well, it's also contingent on the idea that it represents all fans. We've already given you a couple of reasons on why this is not the case, which I'll go more into a little bit down the line here. But the second part of this is that those fans are smart and capable individuals. Even if you get some fans who are reading the briefings they talk about, we tell you that due to those things like egotism, due to these things that say we legitimize your view as a football fan and your ability to make these decisions with this policy, you encourage those types of attitudes, you much, much worsen them, no engagement with this characterization, on-site affirming. But also on the point of democracy representing all fans. Their second literally modeled out the material at first on getting more fans to engage in the sport when you offer them season tickets, offer them some sort of power, which was based on the assumption that giving season ticket buyers this power is going to encourage non-fans to buy season tickets. Look, firstly, that's not true. I already explained in my second why that's quite assertive. Secondly, that means you are going to get less educated, experienced fans, which is the entire benefit your case is relying on. And thirdly, fans don't want to move to a stadium because they take that personal offense to it for the reasons Jess gave you at first, even if it can hold more people, create this fat atmosphere, and expand the fan base. What we get then is Ash's best case is that they managed to somehow catch all those bad intended ticket buyers and let in all the good ones to buy tickets. That still doesn't matter if they can't prove that they have the capacity to be rational. When they don't engage with our layered characterization and in fact worsen those things like misguided egotism by legitimizing this power. We give you an entire sub on what good decisions that fans may be adverse to, like selling a team, getting that capital, buying new players that are more modern, that are better at playing the game. There's no engagement with why this would not be the case with fans. That is why they lose this point. Secondly, then on players, F starts talking about diversity, and the proof that they give us as this being a main benefit is football has become more diverse over time. Whilst ignoring that people who buy season tickets are still those, as they characterize, with long family lineage and association with a sport that makes them innately more conservative, as we tell you. I also tell you at second that the voting bloc that keeps all reliable who performed well 5 years ago due to that optimism bias is keeping out that new diverse generation of players they can't even claim this key benefit. What we get then is the question of why are a select group of owners more subject to public scrutiny, somehow more likely to be racist than the quintessential sport fanatic they are not, that it's the hooliganism that they accept, that they endorse, so proud to oppose.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now call on the leader of the affirming team to wrap up this morning's debate.
Oh, I look good. I do. All right. Am I audible? Not glitching out at all? It's great. That's that Nelson Wi-Fi, eh? All right. We think that negating loses this debate at the point where they spend their entire third speech responding to the material of their second speaker, yours truly, completely ignoring the direction that Stella was able to take this debate. Let's quickly look then at the gotcha mechanism, which Stella already rebutted, right? The entire, the gotcha here is around the kind of, the focus on statisticians, right? Despite the fact that from first, we have been telling you that investors get the same information that fans do on this side of the house, right? Fans are able to see the works of these statisticians. They're able to consider these things, but also they're exposed to more media, right? They're exposed to different CNN or BBC coverages of these statistician reports, and they're able to get their own analysis of that's simplified to a level where they don't have to spend all day poring over stuff there in the same way that investors do. Statisticians don't make decisions. Investors do at the long time at the end of the day, and we think that Stella proved that to you really well. Look, we think a really important principle that Neg has let fall out of the debate is the idea of democratization, right? This is super important because this is the way that fans bring in the money that teams need to succeed, right? They just naturally have a principled right to democratic input in this business. The negating team loses this debate at the point where they actually fail to give fans any kind of return for the amount of participation that they give their teams. Still though, let's kind of engage on the points of difference between the two cases. All right, on the economic matters, how can we get more money for the team, right? In Neg's best case here, they're able to get better matches, better quality of sport, but note that Stella's proven to you that this is completely untrue, right? What Neg already concedes, even in the case that even in their absolute best world, is that fans are making decisions that represent the fan base as a whole. That means that even in the case that we get worse outcomes in individual matches, we still get more money coming into the teams, we still get more people watching, we still get more people buying merchandise because fans are more engaged. Yes, maybe David Beckham won't win as many games as he used to, but he will bring in more money that can be used to support the team's initiatives in the long term. We guarantee better quality of sport, better entertainment in the long term. We're very, very proud to have won that point of difference, right? All right. Then, on cultural issues, right? Another thing that's really important in this debate is the changing landscape of sports fans. We think that in the face of an increasingly liberal world, this mechanism is incredibly important for protecting the most vulnerable minorities in sporting environments. That's people like women, like people of color, and just actually people who just don't have the ability to engage from the same communities as the traditional sporting fan does. They tell us that there's rich people who are likely to be in these positions. Aside from the mechanisms that Stella and I had already told you about how working class people are more likely to engage with football just as a whole or with sports as a whole, we think in the case of major decisions, the differences between middle class fans who earn 50,000 more a year and working class fans who earn 50,000 less aren't likely to be that different on whether to hire or fire a manager. And so this kind of mostly undercuts their benefits on that. So then what does matter in this point of clash? We think that what matters is the signal sent to fans. We think that if working class fans, if black fans, and if younger fans see themselves being represented, see their voices being heard by the managers of their team, then we are further facilitating this trend of progress in the sporting world. We are so, so proud to affirm.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, cool. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I thank all speakers from both teams for such a high quality debate. Just going to go ahead and end the live stream now.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.